From Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This is Chapter 8, The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this was a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them. And just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out now, Five. Don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I couldn't help it," said Five in a sulky tone. "Seven jogged my elbow." On which Seven looked up and said, "That's right, Five. Always lay the blame on others." "You'd better not talk," said Five. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one who had just spoke. "That's none of your business, Two," said Seven. "Yes, it is my business," said Five, "and I'll tell them. It was for bringing up the cook tulip roots instead of onions." Seven flung down his brush and had just begun, "Well, of all the unjust things," and his eyes just happened to chance upon Alice, who stood there watching them. He checked himself suddenly. The others looked around also, and then all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me, please," asked Alice, "why are you painting those roses?" Five and Seven said nothing, but then looked at Two. Two began in a low voice, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been red rose tree, but we put a white one in here by mistake. And if the Queen was to find out, we should have all of our heads cut off, you know. And so you see, miss, we're doing our best afore she comes to." And at that moment, who said anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen, the Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. And at the sound of many footsteps, Alice looked round, eager to see the Queen. She first came up 10 soldiers carrying clubs, and they were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, and their heads and feet in the corners. And next to the 10 courtiers, there was ornamented all over them with diamonds, walked two and two, as soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along, hand in hand in couples, and they were all ornamented. And then Alice recognized the white rabbit. It was talking in a hurried and nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion, and last of all the grand procession came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought to not lie down on the face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession if people all had to lie down on their faces and they couldn't see it? So she stood there as she was and just waited. When the procession came opposite Alice, they all stopped and looked at her. And the Queen said severely, "Who's this?" She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot!" said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice and went on, "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I shouldn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners who were lying on the ground, around the rose tree. For you see, they were lying on their faces, and the patterns on their back were all the same as the rest of the pack. So she could not tell they were gardeners or soldiers or courtiers or even 3 of her own children. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised by her own courage. "It's no business of mine." The Queen turned crimson with fury, and glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, began screaming, "Off with her head! Off with—" "Nonsense!" said Alice very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon his arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she is only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him and said to the Knave, "Turn them over." The Knave did so very carefully with one foot. "Get up!" said the Queen in a loud, shrill voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King and the Queen and the royal children and everyone else. "Leave off that!" screamed the Queen. "You make me giddy." And then she turned to the rose tree. "And what have you been doing here?" "May it please your Majesty," said Two, in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke. "We were trying—" "I see," said the Queen, and who had meanwhile begun examining the roses. "Off with their heads!" And the procession moved on, and the 3 of them soldiers remained behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice as she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The three soldiers wandered about for a minute or two looking for them and then quietly marched off with the others. Are their heads off? Their heads are gone, if it please your majesty, the soldier shouted in reply. That's right, shouted the queen. Can you play croquet? The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice as the question was evidently meant for her. Yes, shouted Alice. Uh, Come on, then, roared the queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very, very fine day, she said in a timid voice beside her, and she was walking by the white rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. Very, said Alice. Where's the Duchess? Hush, hush, said the rabbit in a low tone, and he looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then he raised himself upon his tiptoe and put his mouth closer to her ear and whispered, She's under a sentence of execution. What for? Said Alice. Did you say what a pity? Asked the rabbit. No, I didn't, said Alice. I didn't say it was a pity at all. What for? She boxed the queen's ears, the rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. Oh, shh, shh, the rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. The queen will hear you, and you see she's came rather late. And the queen said, Get to your places, shouted the queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in the middle in a minute or two, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in all of her life. It had ridges and furrows, and the croquet balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets flamingos. And the soldiers had to double them up themselves and stand their hands on their feet to make them into arches. The chief difficulty Alice found was managing her flamingo, and she managed to get its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm and then let its legs hang down. But generally she had to get its neck nicely straightened out and give the hedgehog a blow to its head, and it would twist itself and look up into her face with such a puzzled expression she could not help bursting into laughter. And when she had got its head down, she was going to begin again. It was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in fact crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or a furrow in the way that wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to, and as she doubled up, the soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground. Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once without waiting turns, quarreling all the while, and fighting for hedgehogs, and in a very short time the queen was in a furious passion and was stamping about, shouting, Off with his head, or off with her head, and about once in a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy, to be sure, for she had not yet had any dispute with the queen, but knew it might happen at any minute. And then thought she, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. It's a great wonder that there's anyone left alive. She was looking about for some way of escape, when wondering whether she could get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it for a minute or two, she began to make out a grin, and she said to herself, It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have somebody to talk to. How are you getting on? Said the cat, as soon as there was a mouth enough for it to speak with. The Alice waited for its eyes to appear, and then nodded. It's no use speaking to it, she thought, till it has ears to come, or at least one of them. In another minute or so, the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began to account the game, feeling very glad that she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared. I don't think they play very fairly at all, she said. Alice began in a rather complaining tone, and they quarrel so dreadfully that one can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least if there are, nobody attends them, and there's no idea of how confusing things are being alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through the next, walking about to the other end of the ground, and I should have croqueted the queen's hedgehog just now, only and it ran away, and when it saw mine coming. How do you like the queen? Said the cat in a low voice. Not at all. She's so extremely. And just then she noticed that the queen was close behind her listening, and so she went likely to win. It's hardly worth while finishing the game. The queen smiled and passed on. "Who are you talking to?" said the king, coming up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with a great curiosity. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire cat. Allow me to introduce it." "I don't like the look of it at all," said the king. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." "I'd rather not," the cat remarked. "Don't be impertinent," said the king, "and don't look at me like that." And he got behind Alice as he spoke. "My cat may look A cat may look at a king," said Alice. "I've read in some book, but I don't remember where." "Well, it must be removed," said the king very decidedly, and he called to the queen, who was passing by at the moment. "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." The queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. "Off with his head," she said, without even looking around. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," said the king eagerly, and hurried off. Alice thought she may as well go back and see how the game was going on, and she heard the queen's voice in the distance, screaming with passion. She had already heard three three of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she did not like the look of things at all. The game was in such confusion she never knew whether it was her turn or not, so she just went off in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice to be an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it trying in a helpless sort of way to fly up a tree. But at the time she caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over and the hedgehogs were out of sight. But it doesn't matter much, thought Alice. All the arches have gone away to the other side of the ground. And so she tucked it away under her arm that it might not escape again, and went back to have a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was quite surprised to find a large crowd collected round it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the king, and the queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were very silent and looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she appealed to by all three to settle the question. They were repeated their arguments to her, though as they said them all, they spoke at once, and she found it very hard to make out what exactly they said. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off the head unless there was a body to cut it off from, and he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at this time in his life. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't supposed to talk such nonsense. The queen's argument was that if somebody wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody executed all around. It was this last remark which made the whole party look so grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say, but "It belongs to the Duchess. You'd better ask her about it." "She's in prison," said the queen to the executioner. "Fetch her here," and the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and by the time he had come back with the Duchess it had entirely disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game.